A Baker's Dozen, a New York's Christmas story. Back in the old days, I had a successful bake shop in Albany, New York. I had a good business, a plump wife, and a big family. I was a happy man. But trouble came to my shop one year in the guise of an old, ugly woman. She entered my shop a few minutes before closing and said, "I wish to have a dozen cookies." She pointed to my special St. Nicholas cookies that were sitting out on a tray. So I counted out 12 cookies for her. The old woman's eyes narrowed when she saw the cookies. "Only 12?" she asked. I knew at once what she wanted. There were some bakers in town who sometimes give an extra cookie for their customers, but I was appalled by this custom. What man of sense would give away an extra cookie for free? "I asked for a dozen cookies and you only give me 12, the woman said. "A dozen is 12, my good woman, and that is what I have given you," I replied. "I ordered a dozen, not 12, the old woman said. I was upset by this demand. I always give my customers exactly what they paid for. But I was a thrifty man, and it was against my nature to give away something for nothing. "I have a family to support," I said stiffly. "If I give away all my cookies, how can I feed my family? A dozen is 12, not 13. Take it or leave it." "Very well," she said, and left the shop without taking the cookies. From that moment on, my luck changed. The next day, my cookies were stolen out of my shop. The thieves were never found. Then my bread refused to rise. For a week, every loaf of my bread I made was so heavy that it fell right through the oven into the fire. The next week, the bread rose so high it actually floated up into the chimney. I was frightened when I saw the loaves floating away across the rooftops. This was the first moment I realized I had been bewitched. It was then that I remembered the old woman who had come into my shop, and I was afraid. The next week, the old woman appeared again in my shop and demanded a baker's dozen of the last batch of cookies that I had. I was angry. How dare she show her face in my shop after all the bad luck she had sent my way? I cursed her soundly and showed her the door. Things became worse for me then. My bread soured, and my donuts were a disgrace. Every cake I made collapsed as soon as it came out of the oven. My gingerbread children and my cookies lost their flavor. Word was getting around that my bake shop was no good, and one by one my customers were falling away. I was angry now and stubborn. No witch was going to defeat me. When she came to the bake shop a third time and demanded a baker's dozen of cookies, I told her to go to the devil, and I locked the door behind her. After that day, everything I baked was either burnt or soggy, too light or too heavy. My customers began to avoid my cursed shop. Even those who had come to me since the very beginning of my years. Finally, my family and I were the only ones eating my baking, and my money was running out. I was desperate. I took myself to church and began to pray to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of merchants, to lift the witch's curse from myself and my family. "Come and advise me, St. Nicholas, for my family is in dire straits, and I need good counsel against this evil witch who stands against me. I pray." Then I trudged wearily back to my empty shop, wondering what to do. I stirred up a batch of St. Nicholas's cookies and put them into the oven to bake, wondering how this lot would turn out. Too much cinnamon? Too little? Burnt? Underdone? But to my surprise, they came out perfectly. I frosted them carefully and put my first successful baking in weeks onto a tray where they could be seen through the window. When I looked up, St. Nicholas was standing in front of me. I knew him at once, the patron saint of merchants, sailors, and children. He was not carrying the gold staff or wearing the red bishop's robes or a muted hat that appeared on the figure I had just frosted on my cookies. But the white beard and the kindly eyes were the same. I was trembling so much my legs would not hold me up, so I sat down on the stool and looked up at the saint standing so near I could have touched him. His eyes regarded me with such sadness it made me want to weep. St. Nicholas said softly, "I spent my whole life giving money to those in need, helping the sick and suffering, and caring for the little children, just like our Lord taught us. God in His mercy has been generous to us, and we should be generous to those around us." I could not bear to look up into his eyes. So I buried my face in my hands. Is an extra cookie so terrible priced to pay for a generosity of God has shown us? I didn't say that very well. He asked gently, touching my head with his hand. Then he was gone. A moment later, I heard the shop door open and footsteps approaching the counter. I knew before I looked up that it was the ugly old woman had returned to ask me for a dozen of St. Nicholas's cookies. I got up slowly, counted 13 cookies, and gave them to the old woman free of charge. She nodded her head briskly, and the spell was broken. From that time onward, a dozen cookies was 13. And from that day onward, I gave generously of my baking and of my money, and 13 was always for me a baker's dozen.